Speed painting is an artistic technique where the artist has a limited time to finish the work. It can also be a means within which you get your plastic minis to the battlefield quick sharp. And here's the catch. You don't even have to be that good a painter to make your miniatures come to life. My name is Benji, and this is Marvel Crisis Protocol's Black Widow Speed Painting Guide for the Casual Layman Painter. So to the disclaimers, I am not myself a pro painter, as you're about to find out. But trust me when I say that the learning curve to make a Marvel Mini or similar look good on the tabletop is not as steep as you might think. Over the course of the next few minutes, we're going to give you some semi-pro tips to find a nice balance between speed and quality, allowing you to get excellent looking plastic in no time at all. So at the core of this guide, and what we'll be using, is the Citadel Contrast paint range, which allows you to get the look of applying 2 coats of paint all in one go. But because I'm Johnny Helpful, we'll also display on screen equivalent paints you can use if you don't have access to or don't wish to use Citadel paints. First things first, then you need to prime your model. If you don't know why, well then this is already too advanced for you, and you should probably Google YouTube some miniature painting basics. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we're also not going in for any of that zenithal highlighting guff. This is just take it out in the backyard, put it in a box and spray it with an undercoat. Now, because we're using Citadel Contrast paints as our starting off point, we're going to play by their rules and use the Rathbone spray to undercoat prime our KGB spy turned Avenger. We're then going to grab our paintbrush and start splashing on the base coat washes, starting with some Wildwood on the gun holster and straps. This is the darkest brown option in the range and hits just about the right dark leather tone. I find I opt whenever I utilise these contrast paints to use a slightly larger brush tip than usual, just so the watery texture can absorb fully, and you can apply it with a bit more gusto than you would with more conventional acrylic paints. We then opted for Nastreg Yellow for the braces, belt and clasp in the middle, as it's a decent base stroke makeshift colour for gold and brass. You see, this is one of the limitations of the contrast range. No stock gold and silver. But this still provides an adequate substitute. And you might have started to notice a pattern with the order in which we're painting, and that's that we're focusing on the raised parts of the miniature first. And that's predominantly because it's often easier to paint the lower sections without mistakes, as you're able to push the brush right up to the edge of where you need to stop. And so, continuing that trend, we needed some red-headed, as that seems to be the go-to for Ms. Romanoff. Here we've splashed Flesh Tearers red on the mop. Apparently it's the new thing in the hair colouring world. Don't be afraid to slap this on good, and remember, don't worry too much about mistakes. If you go over onto a catsuit, it'll be no trouble just painting over it later with the darker colour. And if you go over on the facial area, the worst that's going to happen is if the paints we used for flesh later don't cover it, we can just use some potted Rathbone to go over the affected areas. Catsuit time next with some Black Templar. Again, lather on the larger areas like this with a decent amount of paint on the brush. More is often less when it comes to applying contrast paints. In part because of its low viscosity, it won't always apply the depth of colour you expect if you just try and thin coat nonsense it on. And that can be very true of Black Templar. Don't be shy now, cake it on, and then watch for any excess pools of paint and soak them up with an empty brush. Make sure you're periodically keeping an eye out for pooling whenever you use these paints, and make sure you paint the gun in the holster with this colour too, as we're going to highlight it later. Which leaves us with just the face on the body of the model, and here Guilliman Flesh is the colour of choice. I sneakily dashed a line of Abaddon Black north to south in the eye socket with the smallest brush I could find, to give some paint to the pupil. but painting eyes is very much optional, and especially with her gaze looking slightly downwards and the eye slits being so small, it's barely noticeable either way. Which left us with just the base, and here it's Basilicanum Grey to the rescue. And it applied nicely considering the flat surfaces aren't necessarily a contrast paint's best friend. Thankfully, the small recesses found across the base really helped bring the paint to life. Once again, more is better, and take away as you need to get it looking how you want it. And whilst I wouldn't necessarily recommend using contrast paints around the rim of the base, what you see on screen is how this turns out. Now, you could of course call it a day there. The subject of what is tabletop quality is hotly debated, but all that matters is what you think. That being said, I like to at the very least go over a model with one highlight. More often than not to bring a bit more vibrancy and brightness back to a model. If this were a base coat and wash jobbo, then more often than not you want to bring some life back into the Mini. So let's take a look at what we can achieve with a second lick of paint. We more or less go over the things in the same order, and we had many choices to highlight the leather. And this time we went with Baneblade Brown. As with all these paints, they all come from the larger Games Workshop paint range, and I'm not overly enamoured with this colour for leather, but it's a layer progression that the Citadel app recommends, so it'll do. Of course, this will be one of your first real challenges as well, not making mistakes on the straps, but not to worry if you do. Grab the nearest dark grey or black paint you can find. I used Eshin Grey here to go over any paint that gets on the catsuit. We had a similar litany of choices when it came to the braces and belt, because we could go gold or brass. Either would probably work, but I wanted something almost in between, and so opted for Gehenna's Gold. Although any Bryce or brighter gold will do the trick depending on how you like your shinies to look. I was fairly liberal with the paint here as I wanted to see how it layered on top of the quote unquote yellow, and I was quite pleased with the outcome. As you might have noticed, I didn't go over the clasp on her chest, and that wasn't initially by design, just plain forgetfulness. But as a wise man once opined about happy little accidents, I was pleased with it and so didn't go back over it. Moving to the hair, I wanted to accentuate some orange to provide a contrast, and ended up with Wild Rider Red, an almost red orange that gave me just what I needed. I didn't do the best job because the paint had got bulked gathering dust in the drawer for longer than I'm willing to admit, so it was a bit of a slapdash application. But if you concentrate on just the raised parts of the hair and leave the red and the darker pooling in the deeper parts of the hair, you'll find yourself with some realistic looking redhead. Moving to the face, I always feel a model's coming together when I apply the layer of Cadian flesh tone or equivalent. It's normally always one of the finishing touches, and once again that feels the same here. Although to be fair to the contrast paint, it does a solid job mimicking human flesh, but it does, upon closer inspection, look a little bit pale and gaunt, and the added highlight puts some colour back in those cheeks. It was Catsuit next, but the whole time since I'd painted the Black Templar contrast coat on, I was so impressed with it. I kept thinking there was potential for no improvement at all with the highlight of Eshin Grey. You expect the darker parts to be where you need them, but the lighter parts were also pretty much spot on for our needs, and so I opted to leave as is. If you do decide to add an extra layer, there's no need to overdo it, with the contrast paint doing a reasonable job already underneath. Just focus on the raised areas of her arms, legs and shoulders, and you'll come out with a nice finished job. It's at that point that we added one last luxury touch to the body of the model, with some lead belcher bringing the silver out of the parts of the gun that could be seen in the holster, but also the buckles on the straps and the zipper on the catsuit. Usually lead belcher would be the first paint you would apply on silver metal surfaces, as it's a base paint, and quite a dull looking silver. But because we don't need these elements to really pop, this finish was more than suitable. which left us once again with just the base to highlight, and then we can go home. And for this, a Drybrush of Administratum Grey was appropriately lighter and would bring that brightness to the surface. Of course, the beauty of dry brushing is that it brings those small particles just to the very top of the surface, and also gives a worn look that you would expect from the sidewalk pavement on the base of this here model. And that, as they say, was that. I'm sure many of you will be happy with just the contrast paint steps, which, bearing in mind how easily it applies, especially to the larger surfaces, will take no time at all. It just goes to show what can be achieved with minimal time investment, no matter how far through the video you got. Stay tuned for more speed painting guides for those that want less time painting, more time gaming. Alas, I have been your host Benji, and this video has ended.